So, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on your time zone. Welcome, everyone, to our JVP Health Advisory Council webinar. And Ramadan Kareem to those who are celebrating Ramadan. And also, today's program is dedicated to the women of Palestine in, excuse me, in honor of International Women's Day, which I believe Faris will be saying a word about as well. My name is Phil Brewer, and I'm a member of Jewish Voice for Peace Health Advisory Council Steering Committee. I'll be the moderator of today's program. My co-moderator is Rachel Rubin, who will explain how to submit questions for the Q&A. Rachel?
Yeah, hi, thanks. We respect that people will keep themselves muted throughout the presentation, and then to please put your questions in the chat. I wouldn't use the QA function. If for some reason your chat is not working, you can put them there, but the idea is to put them into the uh, into the chat, and then other people can see what those questions are. There's also captioning if people would like to have a tickler at the bottom with the transcription as the presentation goes on. You can click that at the bottom uh, panel. It says show captions. Sometimes people have to click their more three-dot icon in order to get to that, but you can see at least English language captions for today. And that's it. Thanks.
Okay. So after the events of October 2023, we increased the frequency of our webinars from quarterly to monthly. And each program begins with the remarks that we're making now, and then the introduction of our guest, who generally will speak for about 20 minutes. And that will be followed by a limited number of questions from the moderator and co-moderator. And then that's followed by the questions that you type into the chat. Um, all in all, the programs tend to run about 60 minutes, sometimes over, depending upon the topic. And as we said, this is being recorded, so if you don't want to be seen in the recording, just turn off your camera. And some people are sensitive about having their name appear as well, and you can rename yourself into whatever you want to put there. So today's guest is Faris Giacaman. Faris is, first of all, Faris is the nephew of Mike Giacaman, who I trained with in internal medicine in St. Louis. um, and Mike is who actually referred me to Faris as somebody uh, that we might want to have as one of our speakers. He's the former managing editor and now the Palestine editorial director of Mondoweiss, which is one of the most respected publications and organizations bringing news to the Middle East of the Palestinian struggle to the world. He's also a doctoral candidate in History and Middle East Joint Program at New York University and will be coming to us from his base in Ramallah today. In April of 2024, Mondoweiss published an article by Faris entitled Israel Destroyed Al-Shifa Hospital to Accelerate Social Collapse in Gaza. As a physician, my focus on this event was always focused on the medical aspects and the trauma aspects. And this article opened my eyes to the many roles that the hospitals play and played as not just a medical facility, but as a social institution and refuge. And so Ferris is going to um, pick up with that article and also hopefully touch on uh, medical issues, related medical issues in the West Bank as well as Lebanon and the other many places that Israel has been wreaking havoc. So, Ferris, thank you so much for joining us today. It's an honor to have you, and the podium is all yours.
Thank you so much, Phil. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. And thank you everyone for joining us today, and many thanks to the JVP Health Advisory Council for putting this webinar together. As Phil mentioned, I work at Mondoweiss, which is one of the leading publications in the Palestine Solidarity Movement and within the movement journalism space more broadly. My own work has recently focused on leading and developing Mondoweiss's Palestine Bureau, which is one of the things that makes Mondoweiss's Palestine coverage so unique. The fact that we have a bureau based in Palestine with full-time dedicated staff. Today, I'm going to be speaking about the centrality of the attack on Gaza's health infrastructure to the overall Israeli genocidal campaign in Gaza over 15 months of war. The fact that today coincides with International Working Women's Day to me is particularly auspicious because the true heroes of the past year and a half were those who sustained the very conditions for life in Gaza. Those are the women who gave birth without the aid of modern medicine, who had C-sections without anesthesia, and who protected the children of Gaza from death and saved an entire generation. They are the women doctors and nurses who provided vital life-giving care to Gaza's sick and injured, and who remained with their patients in the face of Israeli siege, bombardment, and massacres. They are the people who engaged in the crucial, often invisible forms of labor and care under harrowing conditions that continue to serve as the main bulwark against Israel's war of extermination. These are the people we should honor alongside all the other martyrs of Gaza who resisted Israel's death machine through every means. In today's talk, I'm going to focus on one important aspect of this genocidal campaign, which is the role of hospitals as vital social institutions beyond the role of providing strictly medical care to Gaza's people, as Phil mentioned. This focus is the product of the coverage of fellow colleagues and staff at Mondoweiss of how Gaza hospitals attempted to resist the erosion of their society. What follows is going to present some of that coverage over the past year and a half. And in many cases, I'm going to be quoting or paraphrasing the writing done by either myself or my colleagues at Mondoweiss. Now, I want to start from one particular moment in the genocide that I think captures the collection of circumstances that led us to the conclusion that Israel's targeting of hospitals was a deliberate policy and that its objective was to engineer social collapse in Gaza. That moment was the second major invasion of Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza City, which is in the northern half of Gaza, and it was a pivotal moment in the genocide. Between March 17 and March 17th and March 18th in 2024, a number of things happened that seemingly had nothing to do with each other. At 2 a.m. on March 17, the Israeli army stormed Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza City, entering with tanks and heavy gunfire. The day before, 13 aid trucks arrived in northern Gaza for the first time in 4 months without being turned back by the Israeli army or resulting in the massacre of starving Palestinian aid seekers. People flocking to the UNRWA warehouse in Jabalia refugee camp to receive the aid stood in uncharacteristically orderly lines and patiently waited for the handouts of flour, rice, and other foodstuffs. Many could be seen cheering once the aid arrived, a scene captured by Al Jazeera's coverage. But what few people know is that this successful delivery of sorely needed food aid to the northern Gaza Strip is what led the Israeli army to launch its deadly raid on Al-Shifa Hospital the very next day. The connection between these two events can only be explained by understanding who Israel was targeting in the raid. The now martyred Fayq al-Mabhouh. Mabhouh was the director of operations of the Gaza police force, which was a part of the Gaza government's civilian administration. Unlike Hamas's military wing, the Qassam brigades, Mabhouh did not operate clandestinely at the start of the war because he didn't have to. He was in charge of civil law enforcement. And Hamas released a statement after his death confirming that he engaged in purely civil and humanitarian activity. Yet, to hear Israeli military spokespersons and the Israeli media, Israel had launched a, quote, precise operation on Al-Shifa to target a, quote unquote, top Hamas operative or a senior Hamas commander who the army alleged was planning attacks on Israel. Now, making such brazen claims without evidence to justify attacking hospitals and shelters has been a hallmark of the Israeli army's conduct throughout its genocidal assault. But the true significance of the attack lies not in its desire to empty northern Gaza's largest civilian refuge, which housed 30,000 people at the time, but in foiling Faye Mabhour's pivotal role in coordinating the delivery of humanitarian aid to starving civilians in Gaza, while restoring a semblance of social order to the north. In other words, the attack on Al-Shifa was an assassination operation aimed at breaking down civil order in northern Gaza. It aimed to facilitate Israel's genocidal project and pave the way for total control over the area without resistance. Now, this affair highlights a key fact about the importance of hospitals in Gaza, not only as spaces for healing, but also as crucial social institutions. Hospitals in Gaza during times of war have not only served as places for the treatment of the wounded and the sick, but also housed a microcosm of Gaza's entire civic order. They became hubs for journalists and human rights defenders, offered space for Gaza's civil defense teams to organize and coordinate rescue efforts. They became a base of operations for Gaza's police force, and they hosted tens of thousands of displaced refugees seeking shelter from the bombardment. Hospitals became all those things because they were the last remaining civilian institution that was supposed to enjoy a modicum of protection from the war. In other words, they housed all the trappings of what makes a society function. In lieu of dismantling Gaza's resistance infrastructure, a goal that the Israeli army failed to do throughout 15 months of war, one of Israel's war aims in Gaza was to precipitate social breakdown. And the way of doing that was by targeting hospitals. It started with Israel's bombing of the Al Ahli Arab Hospital on October 18, which killed 400 people. It was the first time that people in Gaza realized that nowhere was safe. It continued the next month with the first assault on Al-Shifa on November 15. In these days leading up to the invasion, the hospital had been placed under siege, and medical staff and doctors were shot through windows by snipers and in the hospital's main courtyard. When others rushed out to try and save them, they were shot down too, until no one dared leave the buildings. The injured were left to bleed out and die, and then to rot and to be eaten by stray animals. When the Israeli army entered, it cleared out the hospital of its staff, patients, and displaced refugees. Israeli propaganda began to flood the media with images of weapons stuffed behind an MRI machine, one of the few flimsy pieces of evidence alleging the hospital's use as a military command and control center. But despite the fact that Israel's claims about Al-Shifa turned out to be baseless, as was revealed in many different media investigations, including, in fact, the Washington Post, the invasion set an important precedent for what was considered acceptable conduct throughout the war. What was previously unthinkable now became commonplace, setting the stage for what was to come. Now, after the army withdrew from parts of northern Gaza towards the end of 2023, including the area surrounding Al-Shifa, medical staff and patients returned to the hospital. Al-Shifa was quickly rehabilitated and resumed its status as a hub for displaced people and for civil society actors. But with the start of 2024, famine and starvation began to set in. And the systematic deprivation of food aid and the targeting of aid seekers at the Kuwaiti and Nablus roundabouts in northern Gaza led to several massacres. These massacres created a crisis for the local population. One of the most infamous ones at the Nablus roundabout is known as the Flower Massacre, in which 100 people were killed. And that's what prompted the second invasion of Al-Shifa at the end of March 2024. That is the rehabilitation of Al-Shifa and its return as a crucial institution in the north. This time, however, the Israelis were bent on destroying the hospital once and for all, and it was determined to send a message to the rest of northern Gaza that nowhere is safe. Mondowei's correspondent, Tariq Hajjaj, who is now in Egypt, contacted many survivors of the events at Al-Shifa. One of them refused to speak and feared exposing their identities. A few others accepted under the condition of anonymity, fearing that their testimonies would make them targets by the Israeli army and that they would be subsequently killed. But the picture that emerged from our investigations is equal parts harrowing and infuriating. One young man who managed to escape the hospital mere moments before the army invasion began said that there had been indeed hundreds of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad affiliated employees in the hospital, but none of them were military operatives. They were workers in the Gaza government's civil branch, including civil defense crews, the police force, the internal security forces, interior ministry employees, and employees of other branches of the local government. All of them had gathered to receive their governmental salaries at Al-Shifa, given that it was one of the few remaining places that was supposed to be relatively safe from the fighting. The young man said there was a room in the specialized surgeries building that served as an office for the government branches that operated above ground, referencing the Hamas government civilian branches. The man also confirmed that a number of PIJ members, Palestinian Islamic Jihad members, who worked non-military jobs were also present to receive their salaries. Now, the way the Israeli army described the gathering was that it obtained confirmed intelligence reporting that a large number of terror operatives from both groups inside Al-Shifa were gathering, and that it had announced 900 suspects and confirmed 500 of them were terror operatives. And it also announced that 200 more quote-unquote gunmen were killed, including top commanders in Hamas and the PIJ. The medical compound housed several buildings, including maternity wards, specialized surgery buildings, and cardiac wings. When the soldiers entered the compound, everyone was ordered to evacuate the buildings. Drones carrying speakers broadcast the army's orders, telling people that they must exit and gather in the courtyard. And the drones kept saying, "Come out, you animals," according to the witness who spoke to Mondoweiss. When everyone left the building, the army began to separate the crowds of people into groups and made each group wear differently colored plastic bracelets. Yellow for the hospital staff and whoever the army considered civilians, and red for those who could not move on their own, patients, the injured, amputees, people with broken limbs. The army also gathered people who were suspected of belonging to Hamas or the PIJ. They were not given bracelets, but were all executed en masse and buried in a mass grave with army bulldozers. A third, much larger group was ordered to leave the hospital, including thousands of displaced people. There were also reports of patients shot in their beds who could not leave, and of medical staff being killed when they refused to abandon their patients. The invasion of Al-Shifa set the tone for how Israel would treat medical institutions throughout the course of the genocide. At Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis in southern Gaza, Palestinian civil defense teams uncovered a mass grave of 400 people after the invasion of the hospital had concluded and the army withdrew. Many of the bodies of medical staff were found in scrubs, some with their hands bound. Other bodies belonged to patients with medical catheters still attached. More recently, in Kamal Udwan Hospital in northern Gaza's Beit Lahiya, the Israeli army invaded the compound after a siege that lasted for almost 80 days. It was part of what is called the General's Plan, which was the Israeli campaign to ethnically cleanse northern Gaza, and it was launched between October 2024 until the ceasefire was signed in mid-January of this year. The army deployed the use of remote-controlled robots, which dropped explosives that were detonated remotely near the hospital. It fired live bullets and artillery fire at the hospital, and used drones and quadcopters in its attacks. Dozens of people were killed inside the compound, and because the hospital was under siege, they could not bury them in the North Gaza cemeteries, so they were buried in the hospital grounds. But when the army entered, it desecrated the bodies by unearthing them with bulldozers and then burying them again in another mass grave. This mass grave was recently rediscovered at Kamal al-Adwan Hospital just last week, as the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas now hangs by a delicate thread. At the center of Kamal Adwan's defiant last stand before its invasion was Dr. Hussam Abu Safiya, who became a symbol of northern Gaza's steadfastness and the people of it, and the refusal of its people to abandon their homes. That's why Dr. Abu Safiya was arrested following the attack on the hospital, and he remains in Israeli captivity to this day, held without charge or trial. Abu Safiya was first taken to the notorious Sde Tayman torture camp, and now he's being held at Ofar detention center outside of Ramallah. An Israeli news channel aired footage of Abu Safiya being interviewed by a journalist, in which he said, very likely under duress, that he was being treated well by the Israeli intelligence. But other eyewitness testimonies that Mondoweiss obtained from people were with Abu Safiya in prison, and they said that the doctor was likely abused and humiliated, and that he was in a very terrible condition when they met Abu Safiya in prison, specifically in Sde Tayman. Now, other symbols of the Gaza health system were exposed to even worse treatment. Dr. Adnan al-Bursh, a surgeon at Al-Shifa Hospital, was arrested during the invasion of the compound, and numerous media reports later revealed that he was tortured and raped to death in Sde Teman. These acts of human barbarism committed against health professionals are not random. They are a calculated way of hitting the most vital part of Gaza's social infrastructure and the symbols within it. It was a message sent to other health professionals in Gaza, telling them that if they don't abandon their posts, they will meet a similar fate. During the siege near Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital in Deir al-Balah in August 2024, Mondowai spoke to several doctors and hospital staff about the possibility of an impending Israeli invasion. The horrors at Al-Shifa and Nasser hospitals were still fresh in their minds. One doctor told Mondowais that faced with the choice of either obeying the Israeli evacuation order for the area that encompassed the hospital or remaining, she said, both choices are painful for me, but I know what the army is going to do when it invades the hospital. I've been at Al-Shifa hospital. They were running over people with bulldozers and tanks. She also said, there is no chance for survival inside the hospital if we are surrounded by the army. On normal days, we are short on everything, medical supplies, staff, and medical equipment. And this leads us to wonder what would happen if everything stopped coming in altogether for just one day, let alone a long siege. She also said that she's seen the army make no difference between doctors, nurses, civilians, patients, and even premature babies in incubators. She said, if I can escape at the last moment, that's what I will do, but I refuse to witness the same massacre again. An ICU nurse who spoke to Mondowais said the following: we're afraid because of what we saw at the other hospitals. If the army surrounds us, we've considered every possible scenario. Being killed, being buried alive, being burned. We imagine the Israeli army is capable of anything, but we won't leave our people. Another ER doctor told Mondowais that he wouldn't abandon his patients even if it meant his death. This is what he said: we have no plan to evacuate, and we have no plan to operate in the event of a siege. We don't have anything stored for such a scenario. We're working under impossible conditions, but if we leave our positions, if we give up on our duties, we will fail ourselves and our society. We will fail our families and the friends who count on us. He added this: if the army surrounds the hospital, neither us nor the patients will be able to survive for very long, but we will try to do our best until our last breath. We chose this path, and we will stay with the patients and save their lives. Thankfully, Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital was spared the more gruesome fate that other areas witnessed because Deir al-Balah was one of the few areas that were not as extensively targeted by the Israeli army. But months later, Israel besieged and destroyed Kamal Udwan Hospital in its most recent ethnic cleansing blitz before the ceasefire took effect. The implementation of the so-called general's plan hinged in large part on the ability of the Israeli army to empty out the hospital, both as a symbol of steadfastness and as a way of dismantling North Gaza's social infrastructure. We stand right now at a tenuous moment in the ongoing ceasefire, which, as I said, hangs by a thread. The health system in Gaza has been decimated because the Israeli intention is to decimate Palestinian society in Gaza entirely. Palestinians and people the world over await with bated breath for any updates on the fate of Dr. Hussam Abu Safiya and all the other thousands of prisoners who were arrested during the genocide and who underwent unspeakable forms of torture. Now, as the ceasefire threatens to unravel due to Israeli rejectionism and aided and abetted by the US, everyone fears the likelihood of Israel resuming its genocidal onslaught, especially against northern Gaza. The objective is simple: fulfilling the general's plan and preventing the return of Gaza's people to the north once and for all. I'll stop now, and maybe we could leave some time for a few discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to, I have two questions for you, or one comment, one question. Comment, as you say, the ceasefire is holding on by a thread. There's an article from today's Guardian that says that there have already been some sporadic airstrikes on Gaza, ongoing now actually, and that there's a lot of fear that that the ceasefire is going to gradually erode and get back to more intensive bombing and attacks. So that's the observation. The question I have is it possible that by destroying the hospitals, which were regularly accused of being centers for Hamas terrorist activity, um, could it be that destroying the entire health system without destroying Hamas resistance and attacks and so forth, did the Israelis inadvertently prove that the hospitals are not centers of military bases for Hamas, and will they continue to do that if the ceasefire is over, and to whatever extent medical establishments have been put back into some level of operation? And part of that question is, what do you know at this point about uh, how functional any of the medical system in Gaza is at this point?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's a very good one. First of all, regarding the ceasefire, I think that it's important to note that Israel has made several systematic violations of the ongoing ceasefire agreement. From the moment the ceasefire was signed until today, over 100 people in Gaza have already been killed. And this is before the more recent sort of ending of the first phase of the ceasefire. That's the first thing. The second thing, as concerning the claim that hospitals were being used as military bases, the evidence for that was very flimsy from the start. And they also continued to sort of make these outrageous claims. And then when the evidence came to light that they were completely false, the deed had already been done, and then they moved on to the next thing. And the way in which Israel has constantly assaulted the media with atrocity after atrocity, it makes people kind of unable to sort of keep up with the flurry of claims that it makes, many of them being outlandish. There's also another thing that it does, which I think is also plays a role in basically painting the hospitals with that kind of brush. One of them is that it basically regarded any person who was an employee of the Gaza government, which is run by Hamas, essentially painting them as if they are military personnel. So anyone who is a policeman or a firefighter or even an employee of a government hospital, they would report it in the Israeli media as a Hamas operative. So that sort of elision is really has played a really damaging role also in making it appear as if these hospitals are being used as military sites. They do definitely have government employees because, as I said, the existing government, which provides, life preserving services to the civilian population, was based in hospitals because it was a crucial social institution and because hospitals should enjoy this level of protection internationally. So I would say that's also one of the tactics that Israel used. And what was the last part of your question, Phil? I forgot the last component that you asked.
Um, mhm. I got concentrated on something else.
Current status of
Oh,
healthcare.
yeah. So, yeah, what information do you have about current status of, or let's say the reestablishment of some level of healthcare during
Yeah.
this first phase of the ceasefire?
Well, so I don't have specific information, but what I do know is that many of the hospitals that were since razed and destroyed, including Al-Shifa and Kamal Udwan, have at various points had people go back into them and try and salvage what they can. However, it is a far cry away from, what they were operating at when they were at full capacity. and before they were destroyed or razed to the ground. I don't have like very specific information about right now what the situation is on the ground, but one of the very important things is that the situation now, whether it's in northern Gaza or even in the south, is basically one in which the health system has already been decimated, and it's difficult for it to make any sort of recovery without a massive influx of aid. So the deed has, in a way, already been done. And the only people who are left are basically the health professionals who are still at their posts, who are doing the best that they can with extremely finite resources. So that's the broad picture, I'd say. But, you know, I think many others would have been able to tell you the same thing.
So Rachel, do you have any questions, or shall I go on to the questions in the chat? And then John Capadonna has his hand up, but
Yeah, there are no questions in the chat. I did have one question, though, sort of to piggyback on what Phil said,
oh
is if that's
no,
okay.
there are some questions in the chat, but go ahead.
Yeah, I don't see anything in the chat, but I'm going to refresh the chat and see what happens.
Okay.
Was to talk about what do you predict is going to be happening on the West Bank and East Jerusalem in terms of the current siege? And it sounds like it's at a lower intensity, but nonetheless the same kind of project and offensive going on right now in the West Bank as they have been doing in Gaza over the last year and a half.
Yeah, so in the West Bank, the situation is basically escalating and fast deteriorating. Paradoxically, as the ceasefire began, Israel escalated in the West Bank because now that personnel is no longer tied in Gaza, they shifted a lot of the army forces to the West Bank. So what did that entail? It first of all entailed on putting all Palestinian towns and cities on a nearly total lockdown. It made travel between the different cities extremely difficult. Right now, I am in Bethlehem, and but I live in Ramallah. And the road to Bethlehem, when there is a large traffic jam, can take anywhere from 3 hours to, on a bad day, 5 to 7 hours. And this is a trip that, if you were to go in the more direct route through Jerusalem, would take you half an hour. That's in terms of collective punishment. And also in terms of military crackdown, the northern West Bank is now witnessing a massive military campaign on the refugee camps of the northern West Bank. That includes Nur Shams refugee camp and Tul Karim refugee camp in Tul Karim. It includes Al Far'a refugee camp in Tubas. It includes, of course, Jenin refugee camp in Jenin and other places as well. This campaign has resulted in the displacement of well over 40,000 people in the West Bank so far, which is, I heard it, I haven't verified this, but I've heard it mentioned that it is the largest single act of displacement within the West Bank since the 1967 war. So this is an extremely major thing, and it's also a sign of the fact that Israel is also planning to announce its annexation of the West Bank, which is something that Trump seems to have promised Netanyahu, or there are indications that he seems to have promised Netanyahu that thing. And it's also was given as a sort of a consolation prize to the finance minister of Israel, Bezalel Smotrich, who is a hardline sort of fascist fanatic. And, you know, because he didn't want the Israel to sign the ceasefire. And so many analysts have said that the onslaught of the West Bank on the West Bank and eventual annexation would be a consolation prize given to him in exchange for not quitting the government in the event of the signing of a ceasefire. So basically what we're seeing here is that the situation in the West Bank will continue to escalate. It also means that probably the role of the Palestinian Authority will start to gradually sort of erode as a governing force that acts as a subcontractor for the occupation, because elements of the Israeli far right view even this kind of Palestinian collaborationism as something undesirable because it remains Palestinian at the end of the day. And they would rather just take control of the entire West Bank themselves. And the way in which they would prefer to have that done is to displace as many Palestinians as possible from Palestine, but absent that, to concentrate them in smaller and smaller areas, to have them move from Area C, which is about over 60% of the West Bank, into areas A and B, and to sort of isolate them in these cantons and these ghettos, and to make transport between them extremely hard. So that's the situation that I see right now unfolding in the West Bank.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's a grim picture. So there are three questions in the chat. I would suggest that if everybody could put their questions in the chat, this way I'll be able to make sure that people get their questions in order. And I can either ask you to unmute and you can ask your question orally, or I can read them from the chat. So, Anne Saada, you had a question. If you can unmute, that's great. Otherwise, I'll just read out your question.
I did unmute. I can't do the video. I don't quite understand how you're doing this, but I believe I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
We can.
Yes.
So first, thanks very much for this. I actually have two questions. One is, have you, I know there was the early piece of reporting on Al-Shifa, but have you attempted to publish these findings in a as a whole analysis, a narrative, in an article in a mainline journal that would reach beyond the choir, significantly reach beyond the choir? And I have a sub question to that, which is there's so much value in what you just presented that it's hard to know where to start. But in addition to the bigger picture that's so valuable, one of the questions that I think a lot of people have is they keep on hearing that the hospitals in Gaza have been destroyed. And then they hear that the hospitals are functioning. And I think for a lot of people who don't follow the story very closely, it seems like, oh, well, see, the Israelis really didn't destroy the hospital. It was an exaggerated claim because, look, it's open again. And embedded in your story is a much how shall I put it, richer, more accurate, a more explanatory version of what's really going on behind this. Well, they're partially destroyed, or they're so even if just that could get out, so that when the Times or some other newspaper reports it, they don't have an excuse for not being specific.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think that there are many investigations as to what happened at Al Shifa. We put out a report that was based on eyewitness testimony that was compiled by our Gaza correspondent Tariq Hajjaj. He collected that testimony when he was in Gaza at the time. And I could link the story to you, but it's called "Come Out, You Animals: How the Al Shifa Massacre Unfolded." I think that's the title. And since then, many other reports have come out. There was an extensive Al Jazeera documentary about the siege of Al Shifa as well, which you can find on YouTube. You could watch it. In terms of publishing in a mainline journal, I mean, I really think that that's I think this actually connects to one of the questions that someone else asked about how can healthcare professionals contribute, is that, this is the kind of thing that if you're going to go to a medical journal, it should be done by a medical professional who's done the research, and they can use some of the work that we've done, the initial work that we've done in the investigations, to then go and publish things in things like the Lancet or any one of the important medical journals to make some sort of change in the medical community. However, I mean, I am, in honesty, somewhat skeptical as to how effective it will be. However, I think that you shouldn't leave any door without knocking it. And I think that that's an important component. That's regarding the first question as to like the publication of the whole narrative. With regards to the other aspect, I think that one of the amazing things about healthcare workers in Gaza, and I was speaking to a good friend of mine who is a doctor in the West Bank, and he's in regular contact with people in Gaza, and he said that every single time the Israelis entered one of these medical institutions and either destroyed it or vandalized it or burned it to the ground, people would go back in and try and salvage whatever was, still working or half working, whether it's beds, whether it's, whatever it is. And they would make these makeshift sort of field hospitals amid the remains of the destroyed hospital. So, the idea that, oh, well, it wasn't completely destroyed. Well, what does completely mean? Does every single atom have to be vaporized to say that it was destroyed? So I feel that it's kind of ridiculous on its face for that to be assumed. And honestly, the only way that you would sort of not realize how ridiculous that is that if you're already predisposed to be biased against, anything that comes, any narrative that comes from Palestinians, essentially, that they are guilty until proven innocent. So those are some of my thoughts on that. And yeah, I'm sorry, I keep forgetting like the final components of people's questions, but I don't know if that answers everything or if you had another
Yeah,
sort of.
I think your value added is the part about hospitals as social institutions. That's what's not, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's the part that's not really in the other reporting. And that's your value added, and that really deserves to be out there. And if mainline journals want to refuse to publish it, that in itself is a story.
No, I mean, I agree. And the angle that it's a social institution is something that I think became widely apparent, in the initial phases of the genocide, especially because when you look at the proximity of different events to each other. So you had, as I outlined in the talk, you had the siege of Al-Shifa happening a day after aid arrived successfully in Al-Shifa, in Jabalia refugee camp. Who organized the raid? Who organized the aid delivery? The police force. Where was the police force based? In Al-Shifa hospital. Who was the target of the raid? The police force's head, Faiq al-Mabhouh. So it's very clear that, because they're social institutions that basically house they're like a microcosm of Palestinian civil infrastructure, it's naturally going to be a target if your objective is engineering social collapse as part of a genocidal campaign. That's what makes it so stark for us. And I think, this should definitely be outlined. And I think this is part of a wider sort of documentation effort to try and prove it as a pattern. If you're, as a healthcare professional who's sort of researching this, who I think would be the most qualified, like a medical researcher, public health people, to sort of push in that direction and to also to push that angle, that it's not just that they want to target hospitals because they're hospitals. It's because of the vital social role that they play in preserving and maintaining Palestinian social cohesion. So, that's my reaction to that.
Yeah. Well, we have at least three other questions, so let's move on, or four. Let's move on to a different aspect. So, Maxine, you're next, and I think you have a couple of questions here.
Really just one. Thanks a lot, Faris. This is really important and so amazing. Thank you. Just the question is on advocacy. So here you are with a group of healthcare workers. And how do you think our advocacy could be most effective in terms of bringing this narrative forth? Obviously, writing in journals, yes, and other ideas that you have for us. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And I mean, a part of my answer is that I think that you in your professions might have a better idea of where the complicity within the establishment lies and what things to target. And I don't think there's really a one size fits all answer here. So, I mean, if I was to answer strictly within the realm of, the healthcare world and in medicine, a lot of the things that have already been mentioned, like the, sort of the advocacy in the medical and health platforms that are known to you in your professions is something that is very worthwhile to do, pushing back against all of these narratives. And of course, there are the heroic doctors who actually go to Gaza and volunteer. And that is something that should never be overlooked. Or people who even want to fundraise for medical institutions in Gaza to try and get them to continue. I mean, there is a material component here of advocacy and resource, gathering resources to try and aid the medical infrastructure in Gaza as well, of course. That's in terms of the medical field, and obviously being engaged within the Palestine solidarity movement more broadly is definitely something that that everyone should do. And of course, share Mondoweiss articles, please.
Yeah.
Let me let John Capadonna get his question in here. He's had his hand up for a long time. Go ahead, John. You're still muted, John. There you
Hi,
go.
thanks. Thanks for that, Faris. It was wonderful. Questions keep occurring to me, and they keep changing, and you've answered many of them already. I have one idea about getting the word out, and that is medical grand rounds. I plan to think more about doing that. Medical grand round. Well, if you're medical people, you probably know it's a weekly meeting in the departments, various departments. For me, it would be the Department of Medicine, and it's a platform. Many doctors in the hospital attend it. The thing is, I can't give it. You could give it, but as a doctor, I could try to facilitate it. And I'm going to inquire more about that. My other question was, as far as volunteering medical services, I've reached out to one person who was going to try to put me in touch with an organization to allow me to volunteer my medical services in Gaza. I'd have to go for a month. I'm 76, to stay in a tent for a month might be tough. So I wanted to talk to someone. Still, I might be willing to consider it. Are you aware of any other place that needs, doctors? And I'm not a surgeon, unfortunately, but I can treat sick people. I've been doing it for a million years. You're in the West Bank, is that right?
Yeah, I'm in the West Bank.
Are you aware of any organizations that are recruiting foreign doctors?
So there's a myriad of medical organizations across the West Bank that provide crucial care, from the Palestinian Red Crescent Society to the Palestinian Medical Relief Organization to international NGOs I mean, the list is endless. My own bias, not just because I'm Palestinian, but also for practical purposes, is to support existing health infrastructure because they are the best equipped to deal with, to reach their communities, and they already have the infrastructure set. So, whether it's PRCS or medical relief or whichever, I think that getting in touch with any of them, I am sure they would be very happy to accept volunteers, whether it's in the West Bank, Gaza, anywhere. I'm sure it would be extremely important. And they have infrastructures in some of the most important areas of, the areas where a lot of the current violence is unfolding, whether it's in Jenin, whether it's in Tul Karam. So, off the top of my head, that's what I would assume. But I mean, I'm sure later I could look into it and maybe send a more comprehensive list.
Um, that's great. I have one last question. I won't take up everybody's time. Um, the footage that comes on our screens in the United States of destruction in Gaza. I'm aware that Al Jazeera is not permitted there. Certainly, no Western journalists are stationed there, and I would be doubtful that Israeli media would be showing these clips. Where does it come from? When we see destruction of hospitals and stuff, you know, where does that come from? The footage, I mean.
Well, I mean, the thing about the modern world is that everyone has a camera. And so, whether it's just normal everyday people, but it's also the case that there are on the ground, many on the ground journalists in Gaza who do vital work. Some of them are independent journalists, and some of them are with organizations like Al Jazeera, which is one of the larger organizations that is on the ground in Gaza. And there are people who have these large platforms, even though a lot of times they're being shadow banned on social media, but they still have a large following. And, most of the footage comes from them, really. It's Palestinians filming, their lives and everything around them.
Finally, and I won't.
Wait, John, we have only about 3 minutes left.
Then
and
you
we have
move
a
on.
couple
Then
other
please move on.
folks.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. So our final two questions, Alice has a question and then Townsend.
Sure. I was wondering if you could speak about the status of attacks on healthcare institutions in Lebanon by the Israeli forces.
Yeah, in honesty, I don't really have an answer there just because our focus isn't Lebanon. We do occasionally receive sort of articles from journalists in Lebanon, whether it's about, the medical situation or otherwise. But I don't really have any extensive knowledge about that situation in Lebanon specifically.
Okay, thanks. And Townsend Cook?
Thank you, Faris. I wanted to ask if you have spoken to any doctors in Gaza who are worried about the impact of the most recently announced total siege, because I read somewhere that most of the supplies that got in during the first phase of the ceasefire was overwhelmingly food, and I just know the medical sector is very wasteful. Needs a lot of supplies. So, has anyone? Is Mondoise reporting on that, or has anyone you talked to speculated about the potential impact of lack of medical supplies under the current siege? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not personally right now in touch with any, but it is definitely one of the stories we're following. And, simply, yes, obviously there is. Right now, ever since the first phase of the ceasefire ended, Israel essentially cut off all aid going in, including fuel, which runs the generators, which powers what remains of the hospitals. And there's no medical equipment coming in. So yes, obviously, and of course, there's no food coming in either. So obviously, yes, this very directly impacts the health sector and every other vital sector in Gaza right now. And of course, the reason why it's being stopped is because Netanyahu says that this is something that he was quoted on Israeli media saying. He said there shouldn't be free lunch for Gaza. Either you give us hostages or we starve you. This is a quote that I think on Ynet it was. Yeah, so that's essentially the situation there.
Okay. I actually have one more question, and that is, as things shifted towards more attacks in the West Bank, the inevitable bulldozers arrived and began constructing berms around the main hospital in Jenin. and tearing up the water pipes under the roads. That seems to me like a repetition of destroying the social fabric that was already done in Gaza. Do you have any comments about that?
Absolutely. I assume you're referring to Ibn Sina Hospital in Jenin, and
Yeah.
it's absolutely right. This has almost become hackneyed at this point, but a lot of people are talking about how the West Bank is being Gazified, and a component of that is treating specific, especially areas where there's Palestinian resistance that is more strident, whether it's in Jenin or Tul Karem, to treat them as if they are Gaza. And what that comes with is obviously the destruction of infrastructure, tearing up water pipelines, electric lines, and obviously displacement and killing. It's not quite a verbatim sort of copy of the situation in Gaza, but it's getting there, and in a somewhat more limited fashion, but it's picking up steam. So yeah, that's definitely the case. And what's important is that the same soldiers that committed these atrocities in Gaza are the same ones that are now redeployed into the West Bank. So they also carry with them the same kind of experience and sort of operational experience, for lack of a better term. And they're using the same playbook, albeit with some alterations.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for spending the time with us and lending us your expertise. And
Thank you.
I do hope well, I want to recommend to everybody who's on this, if you are not a regular reader of Mondoweiss, that you become one. Mondoweiss also has a podcast. And they also have a donations page because they are a volunteer, not a volunteer organization, but they do rely on financial support from their readers, and I I recommend that you become one. Um, we have a feedback form. Alice has posted in the chat the link to the feedback form, and I would ask everybody who has joined us today to click on that link and submit their feedback to our program. Um,
Bill,
is there? Yes.
it, it's Maxine. It looks like maybe the link on the feedback form isn't working. We have to change
Oh,
the access. So just to let folks know, I guess, um,
Yeah, no, the link is working. I don't know. I'll check on the access piece of it.
that's the problem. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
okay. All right. Next month, our webinar will be with Alexander Smith, who is the USAID senior advisor, who um, resigned from USAID in opposition to having had a presentation that he was about to do canceled, um, and because it discussed infant and neonatal mortality, both from lack of medical care and starvation. And he has become quite vocal in revealing many things going on behind the scenes. And of course, since that time, USAID is now, if not being dismantled, almost completely dismantled by the Chainsaw Massacre people. But that'll be our webinar for next month. Um, any last words from anybody before we close things?
Thanks.
Okay.
This
Is
was
there a way to share? Is there a way to share this? I know healthcare workers who couldn't be here today, like
So
students and all, would love to see
yeah,
it.
so if you just Google JVP Health,
Yeah.
that takes you to the JVP Health Advisory Council website, and many of our webinars are on there. That's why we're recording this today. And so you
Great.
can refer people to that. And
Thank you.
yeah, you're welcome.
I just
should
added
say
in
that
the chat.
anyone who's signed up for this and anyone who's on our mailing list will get a recording, and anyone who follows us on social media will be able to access the recording as well as getting it from the website. So it's another reason to sign up for at jvphealth.org. So you will automatically receive these recordings. It takes me a day or two to get them up, but it will be up.
And I think I fixed the links, so if people refresh, I think they should be able to get into the feedback form. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you all for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you next month. Hopefully you will become supporters and readers of Mondoweiss, and that you will also become regular followers of JVP Health. Let's keep this open for 4 or 5 minutes just to make sure everybody has a chance to click on the link. But otherwise, we're done for the day.
Thank you